Hey kids, so hopefully you've already gotten to watch the last video that we did where we started talking about how do we know what move to make in a game. Because we often get to a spot in a game where you look at the board and there's just so many pieces, there's so many options, and there's nothing obvious, and you're like, okay, what do I do? So in the last video we started talking about this. We introduced the checkmate. Just to review real quick, we mentioned there are really two types of moves, and these are what you should be thinking about when you are deciding your move. Do you need to make a positional move, or do you need to make a tactical move? A positional move is one where you are improving your pieces. You're moving them to squares where they're going to be able to do more, or they're going to control more of the board, or they're going to support one another, or they're keeping your pieces safe. The other types of move, and this is the fun stuff, are the tactical moves. We've talked a lot about tactics when we met in person, especially with forks and pins and skewers and revealed attacks. And we've even looked at some checkmates, because setting up checkmates is tactical as well. And so we've looked at the back rank mate and the lawnmower checkmate and the kiss of death. So these are things we've gone over and over again. And so in order to get to know even better how to make moves, we want to learn more checkmate patterns. Some that aren't necessarily things you just see in the end game. And so that's why in the last video we started looking at what's called the opera mate. We didn't call it the opera mate, but if you read the video name, you'll notice it was called opera mate in the video name. So I'm going to pull up that position that we looked at right here. This is kind of where we started. We said if black moves this rook to this square, that's checkmate, right? See how the bishop defends the rook, and the king can't escape because the queen's blocking the spot, the pawn's blocking the spot. Can't capture the rook because the bishop's defending. The king can't step up because the bishop is guarding that square, and the king can't step over above the rook either because that would be in check by the rook. But while I'm looking at this, this is kind of the pattern we saw in a lot of games, because you typically deal with this with a king castled over on the side, and you break through maybe on the h-file, or I showed you a game where my opponent was breaking through against me on the left side of the board. Well, are all these pieces really necessary though? Just because this is what you see a lot of times in the game doesn't mean all these pieces are necessary. For example, this pawn right here sitting on d3, I don't need that pawn there for checkmates. I can just get rid of it. This is still checkmate. You see, the king doesn't have any new squares. You know what? This queen could be gone, and it's still checkmate. Wow, okay, so look at this. The only square the king is being stopped to move from is diagonally and away from the rook. Okay? So we've got a rook on e1, the king on d1, and a pawn on c2, and that's all it takes. Okay? So there could be a lot of other pieces on the board, but if you see this pattern where the king has a diagonal square that is blocked, and a bishop attacking along the diagonal just in front of that, and the king is on the wall, then if you can get a rook or a queen down here next to the king, protected by the bishop, that's checkmate. Okay, so this checkmate is called the opera mate because of the setting where its most famous game was played. And it was between, Paul Morphy was playing this game in an opera house. Let me back up a move here. It looks like let's start right here. Okay, so take a look at this position and let's think about it. Paul Morphy has the white pieces and his opponents have the black pieces. Look at this king right here. There's a pawn diagonal to that king, and there's a bishop along the diagonal in front of it. So if we can get this knight out of the way and put this rook on this square d8, well, that would be checkmate. So you may want to pause your video real quick and see if you can see the sequence that leads to checkmate here. Alright, now that you've had a chance to look at it, did you see how we get the pieces out of the way? Well, notice, if we take this rook with the bishop, we take the rook on d7 with the bishop, that king is now in check. It's also being attacked by the queen. Okay? So, if the king moves out of check, the bishop just takes the queen. And white should have an easy win from there on, because white's pieces are active, black's pieces are not active, and the queen is going to be able to come down here very quickly and checkmate. Okay, so leaving the bishop alone is not a great idea. But if the queen takes the bishop, then the rook is just going to take the queen, and you just went up, again, you just went up a queen. So, Morphy's opponents decided to take the bishop with a knight. Okay, well now the knight's out of the way of the bishop, but it's still blocking the rook from getting over to the checkmating square. So, Paul Morphy used an idea called distraction and moved this queen up to b8, putting the king in check. The only move his opponent has is to capture the queen with the knight, allowing the rook to come down the long file and give checkmate there on d8. Alright, so that's all it takes, is recognizing that a bishop and a rook or queen can checkmate a king on the edge of the board as long as the bishop is protecting the rook is adjacent to the king, and the king has a pawn diagonally away from the rook. That bishop has to be along that the diagonal right in front of the diagonal with the pawn. So again, we'll flip over here. So we got the king and the pawn on one diagonal, and the bishop on the next diagonal up. Okay. If the bishop was over here, for example, this wouldn't work, right? Because the king could just step up. But as long as the bishop is blocking the king from escaping, that's checkmate. There's nowhere for the king to go. So whenever you see a king and a pawn, or a king in any piece other than a knight would be able to capture the rook, but a pawn, a queen, a rook, a bishop, any of those pieces sitting here diagonal to the king, this is your chance to look for opera mates. Okay, so from here we're going to learn some more checkmates in the next video that are related to the opera mate, but it's in the middle of the board instead of on the edge of the board. And there's some of my favorite checkmates. So stay tuned and we'll see you next time.